I want to begin with a passage over in 1 Timothy, chapter 1, verse 4. You might think that we're going to be on another subject, but we're not.
Hallelujah.
So what are we doing over in 1 Timothy? Well, Paul warns Timothy about giving heed to fables and endless genealogies. So I think we'd all agree we better end our genealogy study tonight before we get into endless genealogies.
Hallelujah.
Which minister questions rather than godly edifying, which is in faith. Well, really that's not what he's talking about. Of course, he's talking about those Jews boasting and trying to trace their genealogy back to some important Old Testament figure, but nevertheless, it does make a lot of sense, however you want to interpret it, that you can only stay with genealogies for so long. They only edify for so long. But the foolish, unfruitful speculation of genealogies is really what he has in mind here, and we're not speculating, we're proving some things as we go along. So the question is, do we believe fully the strict chronology interpretation, or do we believe the gap chronology interpretation of these two chapters in Genesis? We've been looking at some internal indicators that at least point away from believing the strict chronology interpretation, and then we looked at some other things besides just indications, some proofs of the fact that these genealogies in fact can't be taken strictly in order, strictly chronological, because of the various internal reasons that we've given you. Now, so tonight we want to come to external considerations, and we begin back over in chapter 10, verse 10. We can go down through verse 13. We've only got two things we're going to look at under external considerations. First of those is the obvious omissions that are seen, or really you should put that in the singular. We don't have a plurality of them in this case, so you could put the obvious omission. But if there's one, then perhaps there's more than one. If there's one, then perhaps there's more than one. Now let's take our time and look at the passage. Genesis 11 and verse 10. These are the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old, begat Arpachshad. Remember, we changed the spelling there. Arpachshad, 2 years after the flood. And Shem lived after. He begat Arpachshad 500 years and begat sons and daughters. Now, as we said before, the immediate implication is that we're given a father's name and then his firstborn son. And what we were proving last week, among other things, was the fact that if it's a father, it doesn't necessarily have to be the firstborn son. It may be a son, but it may be, like in the case of Abram, the thirdborn son and not the firstborn son, which is going to give us more time. But of course, it doesn't have to be a son at all. So Shem lived after he begat Arpachshad 500 years, begat sons and daughters. Now verse 12. Arpachshad lived 35 years and begat Shelah. The word should be Shelah, not Selah. Shelah. And Arpachshad lived after he begat Shelah 403 years and begat sons and daughters. Now let's just read verses 12 and 13 again very carefully, because we have to use this to prove a point. Arpachshad, this man, Arpachshad, after he was born, he lived up until the age of 35, and when he was 35, then he had a son named Shelah. Isn't that what the passage says? And so this man, Arpachshad, lived after he had had his son, Shelah, 403 years, and during that time he begat sons and daughters. Now, we're under the consideration of the obvious omission. Now, in the Hebrew text, we have something missing. Of course, our Old Testament is taken from the Masoretic Hebrew text. of those books of the Bible. And we have an obvious omission, but it's interesting that it's not omitted in the LXX. In the Greek version, the Septuagint version of the Old Testament, we don't have the omission that we have in the Hebrew text, which came over into our English text. But at the same time, why should we believe the LXX over the Masoretic text? Since the rest of the Old Testament, for the most part, is taken from the Masoretic text and not the LXX text, then why should we trust the LXX over Masoretic, not only with that in mind, but also with this in mind, that the numbers that are given to us of the ages of all of these people in the LXX is just about as different as can be from the Masoretic, which gives us a totally different amount of time between the creation and the flood, and between the flood and Abram. The LXX gives us different figures for the fathers, which gives us different dates. So why believe that over the Masoretic text? Well, we believe it over the Masoretic because Luke gave it to us over in Luke chapter 3. So if you'll turn to Luke 3 and verse 36. So here's where you don't have an endless genealogy. You have a limited one from verse 23 through verse 38. And it's very important that you study the genealogy. It's not always easy in the New Testament because you have the Greek form of the Old Testament Hebrew name, which, as we'll see when we get to some other things tonight, many times is difficult to recognize. Verse 32, Jesse, Obed, Boaz. Verse 31, David. Those aren't difficult to recognize, but some other ones are quite difficult. Anyway, verse 36. Now, it's going backwards now. It's working, Genesis 11 is working forward, Luke 3 is working backwards because you end up with Adam in the last verse. So in other words, you're going to have the names just reversed. So we have to start with this last name of verse 35, which was the son of Salah. Well, that's the Shelah. You see, you wouldn't recognize that. That's the Shelah, which was the son of Cainan, which was the son of Arpachshad. Now, Cainan's not mentioned over there in Genesis 11. It says in Genesis 11 that Shelah is the son of Arpachshad. But here it says that Shelah is the son of Cainan, which is the son of Arpachshad, which makes Shelah the grandson of Arpachshad and not the son. Now keep your hand there. You might want to come back and just look at it and go back and look how plain it appears that the text is in Genesis 11. In verse 12, Arpachshad lived 35 years and begat Shelah. He didn't even beget Shelah. He lived 35 years and begat someone, namely Cainan. You see, you wouldn't know that from here, just someone. He begat someone. Luke tells us he begat Cainan, and then Cainan, and we don't know how old Cainan was whenever Cainan begat Shelah. So in other words, you're missing a whole generation here. Since it's still here in 11 and not in 5, the ages aren't very great whenever the father has a child, so maybe you're only missing 30 or 40 years. But you're still missing 30 or 40 years, which means our 6,159 date for creation couldn't be correct because now again we're missing an amount of time, how much we don't know. But from reading this passage, that's why the genealogies are difficult many times to interpret, sometimes impossible. Why? Because you're simply not given all the information, all that would be necessary to properly interpret the passage that's set before you. And that's why on occasion if I say someone is the son of such and such, that might be true, that might not be true. We might not ever know if he was really the son of someone else. So it might be a general reference. Arpachshad lived 35 years and begat Cainan. Cainan lived a certain amount of time, we don't know how long, and then he begat Shelah. But then when you read verse 13, it almost makes it certain that Arpachshad was really the one who begat Shelah, because it says that he lived after he begat Shelah 403 years. And there's no sense in assuming that we're going to have a same name here, Shelah, just separated by these couple of generations. No, the fact is we've got an omission of a very important name here that's found in Luke 3. Shelah was the son of Cainan, which was the son of Arpachshad, which was the son of, well, there you see Sem, just left out the H, Shem, which was the son of Noe, or Noah in the Old Testament, which was the son of Lamech. And we saw from last week, there's no way to prove that Lamech was actually Noah's father or that Methuselah was Noah's grandfather, because Methuselah would have been swimming around during part of the year of the flood. So probably Methuselah, there were more generations there, so what do we have? Perhaps more omissions. One is provable, Cainan, because Luke gives it to us. But if one is missing, and Methuselah doesn't appear to be the case, that Methuselah could be the grandfather of Noah, then probably one at least is missing between Methuselah and Lamech, and then another one between Lamech and Noah. And maybe more than one. We don't know. So for anyone wants to date the earth at 6,000, the age of the earth at 6,000, you haven't done your homework to say something like that. To say that creation's 4004 BC. You haven't done your homework, because the very genealogies and passages you're using to calculate your time disprove the time you end up with. They will tell you, if you'll study and listen to them carefully enough, and you listen by studying them, they will tell you, if you study them, don't count up my years and get a total sum and figure that as being the date of anything, because I may have left out a number of links that are important in your calculations of biblical chronology. It's just that if the Bible gives us a figure like 430 years, well, we would expect that the 430 years would probably be correct, unless you could prove that it was really 450 years in some other way, which in that case you can't. Okay, and then in the final place, which will take us the rest of this evening, another external consideration is the subject of the ancestral usage of the term begat. Now, under this, we're going to be looking again at important omissions, but they're ones that specifically relate to the term begat and not to any ones missing from the Masoretic Hebrew text or manuscripts. So the ancestral usage of the term begat, and what I mean by that is that the term begat and the term the son of and the term the father of are not always to be taken as we in our society use them today. When you talk about someone's son, you're talking about their literal son. But in Near Eastern culture, you're not necessarily talking about the literal son. As we're seeing with these omissions, you may be talking about a future descendant. The problem is we don't know how future that descendant is. And since we don't, then we're missing an incalculable number of years between point A and point B, which we would think from the language is father, son. Such and such begat Cainan, begat Shelah, Arpachshad begat Shelah. Who begat him? It says both of them begat him. But there can be an ancestral usage of the term begat where the grandfather begat the grandson. And it would be understood that you understood that the grandfather begat his son who begat his grandson. But it would just leave out the son and say that the grandfather begat the grandson. Now let's look at some examples. Daniel chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, 11, 13, 18, and 22. Here in Daniel 5, we have the case of the Babylonian king Belshazzar. And we're going to see, and it's prevalent throughout the Scriptures, Old and New Testament, and it's prevalent even in Near Eastern culture today, so it's nothing that we should think strangely of, that the ancestral usage of the term begat is fairly common. Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords, Daniel 5:1, and drank wine before the 1,000. Belshazzar, whilst he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father, Nebuchadnezzar, had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives, his concubines might drink therein. Then down in verse 11, there is a man in thy kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of thy father, speaking of the father Nebuchadnezzar, of the king Belshazzar, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, the king, I say, thy father. I mean, he's emphasizing thy father. Made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Then down in verse 13, then was Daniel brought in before the king, and the king spake and said unto Daniel, Art thou that Daniel, which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father, Nebuchadnezzar, brought out of Jewry? Then verse 18, O thou king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. And then verse 22, and thou his son, Nebuchadnezzar's, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all of this. And in particular, verse 11, which gives us this statement twice, or really 3 times in the second emphasizing of that fact, Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, the king, I say, thy father, made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Well, Belshazzar's father was the king Nabonidus. And Nebuchadnezzar's son was the king Evil Merodach. They don't fit. But yet more than a half a dozen times here, we're told that Nebuchadnezzar is the father of Belshazzar, and Belshazzar is the son of Nebuchadnezzar. When in fact, Nebuchadnezzar's son is Evil Merodach, and Belshazzar's father is Nabonidus. And so the translators have given to us over in the margin and at least an attempt at explaining the inconsistencies when comparing Daniel 5 with Babylonian records by saying that the father, although that's what the Hebrew is, it's just plain father, really means grandfather. Do you see that over in your margin? Yeah. You've got it beside several places. And no doubt this is the case that Belshazzar is the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar through his mother and not through his father. He couldn't be through his father because his father is Nabonidus, and Nabonidus is not the son of Nebuchadnezzar, Evil Merodach is. But he could be the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar through his mother, and therefore Nebuchadnezzar could be his grandfather. So here's a good case that's been a thorn in some scholars' sides because they know that the Babylonian records don't square up with Daniel 5. Or as they like to say it, Daniel 5 doesn't square up with their Babylonian heathen records, which prove that there's not a father-son relationship between King Nebuchadnezzar and King Belshazzar. But still it calls them father and son. What are we saying? An ancestral usage of the word father. He doesn't mean father. He means an ancestor. Now, it may be his father. A father is just one ancestor, or it could be a grandfather, or a great-grandfather, or a great-great-grandfather. And you can stretch out the G's as far as you go and still call him your father. By that you mean an ancestor, an early ancestor of yours. Then over in 2 Kings chapter 8, verses 25 and 26. The same thing works for females, because this is a case of a queen, a female. 2 Kings 8:25. The 12th year of Joram, this is an Israelite king, the son of Ahab, king of Israel, did Ahaziah, king of Judah, the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, began to reign. 22 years old was Ahaziah when he began to reign, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Athaliah, the daughter of Omri, king of Israel. Now, you don't always have it. I just happen to pick, evidently, a couple of places where you do, a marginal reference that corrects the statement, or at least gives us the full meaning of the statement. Athaliah was the daughter of old wicked King Ahab and Jezebel. And then Ahab was the son of Omri, which makes it a grandfather-granddaughter relationship, as you correctly have over in your margin. So you say, well, how should you read it? Well, it depends on, I guess, who your audience is. If you're reading it to us and you say Athaliah, the daughter of Omri the king, then daughter to us means the next generation. But if you're reading it to someone who's accustomed to an ancestral usage of these familiar terms, then if you said daughter, they might think, well, maybe you mean once removed, one generation down, maybe 2 generations, maybe 3. And so for us, it's not a daughter of Omri the king, it's a daughter of Ahab. And Ahab was the son of Omri, 1 Kings 16, I believe, which makes Athaliah the granddaughter of King Omri. And then a familiar case that many times is passed over is in Ruth chapter 4, verses 13 through 17. We're going to look at some rather long examples. These are just some preliminary examples. Daniel 5, 2 Kings 8, Ruth 4. Some preliminary examples of the ancestral usage of the term begat, as well as son of, daughter of, father of, mother of, and so forth. So, and if you ask, well, how do you know? Well, sometimes you don't know. That's the problem. So you can go ahead and call them mother and father and son and daughter if you don't know otherwise. And if we don't know otherwise, we'll just believe what you're saying. But sometimes you simply don't know. I mean, here it says, so Boaz took Ruth and she was his wife. Well, the whole book of Ruth is written to show that Boaz was a literal man that took a literal woman to wife whose name was Ruth. So we know that's right. He's not talking about a cousin and they had some type of relationship, or a grandfather or grandmother. He's talking about a literal man who takes a literal wife and they become husband and wife. But watch as we go along, it's no longer going to be literal. When he went in unto her, the Lord gave her conception, and she bare a son. The women said unto Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, which hath not left thee this day without a kinsman, that his name may be famous in Israel. And he shall be, speaking of Obed, the son that they have, and he shall be unto thee a restorer of thy life, and a nourisher of thine old age. For thy daughter-in-law, which loveth thee, which is better to thee than 7 sons, hath borne thee. Hopefully you know the story of the book of Ruth, that Ruth is the Moabite's daughter-in-law, not related by blood, but related by marriage, and now her husband is dead, as well as the other son of Naomi. He is dead, his wife is still alive, as well as Naomi's husband, Elimelech. And Naomi took the child and laid it in her bosom and became nurse unto it. And the women, her neighbors, gave it a name, saying, There is a son born to Naomi. And they called his name Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. Well, Obed's not the son of Naomi. Obed is the son of Ruth. And so Naomi, if anything, would be a grandmother. But even there, she's really not a grandmother, because the father of the child isn't a relative of hers, neither is Ruth. Elimelech had a kinsman whose name was Boaz, who wasn't related to Naomi except by the marriage relationship between Elimelech and Naomi. Ruth is not related by blood, but by marriage. In other words, this child here, Obed, has no relation to Naomi at all. All you've got is a remaining still alive daughter-in-law that's not related to you, and then you've got some relative, we don't know how she was kin to Boaz, but you've got some relative from your husband's side of the family, from Elimelech's side, whose name is Boaz. Therefore, by blood, Obed is not related to Naomi in the least. He comes through the male line, through Elimelech's line, as well as through Ruth the Moabitess. But what does it call him? The son of Naomi. Well, you see, you'd be expected to figure out after you'd read the book that they don't mean S-O-N like we would use the word S-O-N, but a relative, an ancestor, and even there it doesn't even fit. But you would understand what's being said here, that she's lost all of her relatives, and this child will serve as though he were a son, or we could say as though he were a grandson. He would be closer, if he could be close to anything, he would be closer to a grandson than a son, so he's going to serve in the place of a grandson. But he's not related. Then over in First Chronicles, with its maze of genealogies, you would expect to find more than one such cases of such usage of these terms. First Chronicles 1:36, your finger there, with Genesis 36:11 and 12. Don't go home and try to figure all the genealogies out. You'll be into endless genealogies then, because they're everywhere. But the only reason we're covering this, there's no sense in pointing this out. I mean, does it help you overcome in your life or anything? No, not really. It's just some knowledge that you add to your mind from the Word of God. But the reason we're pointing this out is it comes up in our study of creation. And if you don't study these things, then you end up with 6,159 for an age of the earth. So either that's right or it's wrong. And if it's not right, and if it is wrong, then prove to us why. Well, that's what we're doing. And we can't prove to you a specific date, but we can prove that that one's wrong. First Chronicles 1:36. Now here we have a son of Esau, whose name is Eliphaz. So this son of Esau, Eliphaz, is going to be mentioned along with what it calls his sons. Just one verse, verse 36. The sons of Eliphaz, Teman, Omar, Zephi, Gatam, Kenaz, and Timnah, and Amalek. Now, you might not know it, but before going on, the word Timnah is a feminine noun. So how can it be a son then? It's a feminine noun. But even if you didn't know that Timnah is feminine, you can turn back to Genesis 36, verses 11 and 12. And let's see the comparison. Now, those were all given to us as grandsons of Esau and as sons of Eliphaz. So Genesis 36 and verse 11. The sons of Eliphaz. Now, the first five are going to parallel the first five names in 1 Chronicles 1:36, with the third one being spelled a little differently, but it's the same name. Teman, Omar, Zepho, and Gatam, and Kenaz. And Timnah was concubine to Eliphaz, Esau's son. Now, how do you like that? She's not related to anybody, except an old concubine. But she's called over here in 1 Chronicles 1:36 a son of Eliphaz. Listed right there with all the sons of Eliphaz. And she's not anything, just a concubine. Well, back to Genesis and reading on. And then this concubine, Timnah, then she bare Eliphaz, Amalek, and so forth. And Amalek was the other name mentioned. So although he's a son by a concubine and not a son by an official wife, that these other five names in Genesis 36:11 are. So again, we've got one of those peculiar verses, just one little verse stuck in there, 1 Chronicles 1:36, with a list of 7 names, the 6th of those being a feminine word, which we find out from Genesis was not a son. Well, feminine tells you it wasn't a son, but it was a concubine. And the 7th and last of those names being truly a son of Eliphaz, but a son by a concubine, Timnah, his name Amalek, and not a son by an official regular wife, I guess we could call him for the Old Testament patriarchs, of official regular wife that bore him the official regular first 5 children. 1 Chronicles 6, verses 22 through 24. Now we're going to be given some priestly descent. You might have to mark these down as a list, and then you can compare them with another list. Looks like we have about 7 or 8 names here. Okay, it looks like what we're going to be given are the sons of Kohath. 1 Chronicles 6:22. The sons of Kohath. And he lists them. Aminadab, his son, so we would have figured that Aminadab, his son, is Kohath's son. Korah, his son. Asir, his son. Elkanah, his son. Ebiasaph, his son. Asir, his son. which means that name's already been mentioned twice. Tahath, his son, and so forth. No sense in going all the way down, but we end up all the way with the prophet Samuel. What he's doing here is giving us the genealogy of the prophet Samuel. Now we can just stay right here in the same chapter on the same page, just over in the next column if you've got a Bible like mine, verses 37 and 38. Now it's going to be counting backwards now. The last name we stopped with was the first name of verse 24, Tahath. So you can work your way backwards. First, the son of Tahath, the son of Asir. Well, all that's right so far. The son of Ebi Asaph, the son of Korah, the son of Izhar, the son of Kohath, back up to Levi. Well, you might not recognize it unless you've drawn up a list, but you've dropped out 2 or 3 names here. And you're still calling one the son of this and another the son of that, and you just gave it to us about 10 or 15 verses before, correctly so, by giving us one after another, after another, after another. And now in the very same chapter, you give us the same genealogy working backwards now, and you leave out a few names, but still call them the son of, the son of, the son of. After another, after another, after another. And now in the very same chapter, you give us the same genealogy working backwards now, and you leave out a few names, but still call them the son of, the son of, the son of. But that is not all. That doesn't mean that the first list over in verses 22 through 24 is correct, because if you go back to, hold your finger there, and go back to Exodus 6 and verse 24. The second list isn't right because it deletes names. The first list isn't right as far as we're concerned because it's not specific. Reading 1 Chronicles 6 again before we go over there. The sons of Kohath, Aminadab his son, Korah his son, Asir his son, Elkanah his son, and so forth. Then Exodus 6:24. The sons of Korah, Asir, Elkanah, and Abiasaph. In other words, the 4th, the 5th, and the 6th names of that first list we gave you are all brothers. Because it says that these 3, Asir, Elkanah, and Abiasaph, are all brothers because they're all sons of Korah. But when you go back to Chronicles, it says the son of, and his son, and his son, and his son. And they weren't sons, they were all brothers together. So again, you've got a usage of this term that completely throws us off track unless we do some studies. So the warning to the wise is, whenever you are studying the genealogies, if you don't have a clear way to prove that someone is the son of someone, obviously Jesus was the son of Mary. Doesn't mean that Mary was his great-great-grandmother. But you've got to have a full account there before you can prove that that was a literal mother and not a great-great-grandmother. Otherwise, we don't have any way of knowing. And that's why Paul says don't get entangled in them, because it really doesn't matter one way or another. Whether Elkanah was Samuel's father or great-grandfather, it really doesn't make any difference at all as far as the Word of God is concerned and the teaching, the spiritual teaching in the Word and our salvation. But the warning is, remember this, and all of these multitudes of genealogies that were given, they're not always given in the way that we think that we could interpret them properly, by going from one generation immediately down to the next one. Now, with those preliminary passages behind us, let's look at 3 important, longer passages where we have a whole genealogy contained that are very, very instructive. The first of these we'll call Matthew's genealogy because it's given to us in Matthew 1. Now, we've looked over in Matthew 1 once before a couple of weeks ago, and I said we'll be back. So we want to come back to Matthew 1, the first 17 verses of his interesting genealogy, and I want to show you some interesting things about this. Now, according to Matthew 1 and verse 17, just like in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, we have perfect symmetry, which would give us the idea that perhaps the arrangement of the names in the first 16 verses is symmetrical and not strictly chronological. Now, do you remember what we mean by symmetrical? In 5 and 11 of Genesis, there were 10 patriarchs. The last one had 3 important sons. It matches too perfectly to be the real thing. And here in Matthew 1 in verse 17, we're told that there were 14 generations, verse 17, from Abraham to David, 14 generations from David to Babylonian captivity, and 14 generations from Babylonian captivity until Christ. Now, it's interesting that we're no longer in the Old Testament. We've come all the way over to the New. It's not that the Old Testament's going to be obscure in its genealogies, and so we kind of trust it and not trust what they say. We're over in New Testament, inspired Gospels here. Matthew, one of the original apostles, writing. And he tells us, so all the generations, from Abraham to David, are 14 generations. And all of them from David until the carrying away into Babylon are 14 generations. And all of them from the carrying away into Babylon until Christ are 14 generations. Perfect symmetry here. How did he end up with this perfect symmetry and this symmetrical order? He didn't end up with it by counting strictly chronological through the names and genealogies of the Old Testament. Let me tell you how he came up with it. In the first place, 3 generations have been dropped in verse 8 between the name Joram and Ozias. Joram is also known, we're talking now about kings of Judah, not of Israel. Joram is also known as Jehoram. We're going to look at a passage that calls him Jehoram. In the Old Testament, it's the same king. Who do you think the Ozias is? Of course, he's the king in the Old Testament, but you probably never heard of Ozias. Uzziah, just the Greek form of Uzziah. So you'll know of whom we speak. Jehoram and Uzziah. But here in Matthew, in the Greek form of the Hebrew words, they're pronounced Joram and Ozias. Okay, then look down at verse 8. I said 3 generations dropped between Joram and Ozias in verse 8. Now you can recognize some of these names as kings in Judah. Asa begat Joshaphat. Joshaphat begat Joram. Joram begat a son, who begat a son, who begat a son, who begat Ozias. But here, New Testament inspired Matthew's Gospel, we're told that Joram begat Ozias. Didn't he? Well, sure he did. He begat him through 3 other generations that are left out here. Without those 3 generations, he couldn't have had Ozias, so he begat Ozias. But he begat Ozias' great-grandfather, then his grandfather, and then his father, and then through the final and the third link came Uzziah, or here in Matthew, Ozias. Now let's look and see where they're found. 2 Kings 8:25. The first name that's missing is Ahaziah. 2 Kings 8:25. You see, in order to find this, you've got to run all through these lists of kings and so forth and find out now, has anyone been dropped out. And just because it doesn't appear that anyone's been dropped out doesn't mean that is necessarily the case. 2 Kings 8:25, the 12th year of Joram. Now this is another Joram. There was a King Joram in Israel, King Joram in Judah. So we're not talking about this Joram. Joram, the son of Ahab, king of Israel, did Ahaziah, the son of Joram, or Jehoram, but it's the same Joram that's mentioned over in Matthew 1 and verse 8. But what does Matthew tell us? It says that Joram, or Jehoram, begat Ozias, or Uzziah. But here we're told that he begat Ahaziah, one of the 3 missing links. Then in 2 Chronicles 22, verses 10 through 11, the second name that is missing, who's the son? In other words, who's the son of Ahaziah? Joash is the son of Ahaziah. 2 Chronicles 22, 10 and 11. When Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw her son was dead, then of course she killed all of the seed that were in line for the throne. And then look down in verse 11, someone named Joash, the son of Ahaziah, was the only one saved among all those that were killed. So now we've gone from Joram down to Ahaziah, down to Joash. We still haven't gotten to Matthew's Ozias yet. And then in 2 Chronicles 24:27, we have the final and the third of the missing links in Matthew 1:8. In other words, the obvious omissions. Not omitted because they're found in some other manuscript, but omitted on the basis of the ancestral usage of these terms, begat, son of, father of, etc. Now concerning his sons, and the greatness of the burdens laid upon him, and the repairing of the house of God, behold, they are written in the commentary of the book of the Kings, and Amaziah, his son, in other words, the son of Joash, reigned in his stead. So we've gone from Joram to Ahaziah, to Joash, to Amaziah, and then, let's see, I don't have a reference, but it probably is the next chapter, 26 and verse 1, 2 Chronicles. Now we get to Uzziah, which means that he really was 4 generations removed from Joram and not just one. So in other words, when Matthew tabulates in verse 17 of chapter 1 all those generations between David and the carrying away into Babylon, and he finds there's 14, we know there have to be at least 17, because from the Old Testament we've proven that he missed 3. Missed them probably on purpose. Why? To aid in memorization. Because it was very important for the Jews to know of whom they came in the Old Testament, and therefore, no doubt, some of these genealogies were condensed and brought into some type of artificial symmetrical form, 10-10 with 3 important sons on both, 14-14-14, because it's easier to memorize. Rather than think that there's 14 between these 2 points, 17 between these, and 24 between these. It'd be easier if it was 14, 14, and 14. But he said 14 generations between King David and captivity. And we know right here there has to be at least 17, because he missed 3 names. But then we're going to have to change that by making another statement. In the second place, 1 generation has been dropped after, let's see, verse 11. So now we're up to 18. Matthew 1 verse 11. And Josias begat Jeconias. Now the Josias, of course, is the familiar king, King Josiah. The Jeconias is Jehoiakim, I-N ending. So we're told that Josiah begat Jehoiakim, I-N ending. Well, let's look over in 2 Kings 23:34. Josiah begetting Jehoiakim. 2 Kings 23:34. And Pharaoh Necho made Eliakim, now watch this, made Eliakim, the son of Josiah, king in the room of Josiah his father, and turned his name to Jehoiakim, I-M ending. In other words, the son of Josiah was not Jehoiakim, I-N, but Jehoiakim, I-M. And then Jehoiakim, I-N, was the son of Jehoiakim, I-M, which makes him the grandson of Josiah as opposed to the son. This is set forth clearly over in 1 Chronicles 3 verses 15 and 16. Where you've got all the names mentioned together, Josiah, Jehoiakim, and then Jeconiah down in verse 16. So, in other words, now we've got another name missing. We're still asking, how did he end up with this 14, 14, 14? And then in the third and final place, this name that we've just been discussing, the last one in verse 11, Jeconias or Jehoiakim, is counted twice. It's counted once in verse 11, and it's counted once in verse 12. Now you'll notice at the end of verse 11 is the carrying away into Babylon. I really should have given you the division on the 14, 14, 14. From Abraham to David would be from verse 1 down to verse 6. Remember, you've got three divisions. Abraham to David is 1 to 6. David to Babylon is 7 to 11. And Babylon to Christ would be 12 through 16. Now, if you're going to count up and say, now, in each one of these three subdivisions, there are 14 generations, you can't count one name twice by counting it in the second subdivision and in the third subdivision. But this is exactly what he does. In other words, this name, Jeconias or Jehoiakim, he can be either stuck with one or the other, but not both. If you take him out of verse 11, then not counting the exceptions we've just looked at, you're only going to have 13 generations between David and Babylon. But then his name is in 11, and then it's in 12 as well. 12 is into our third and final subdivision. You can count the names up later and find out if you don't count Jehoiakim's name in both of them, then one of them's going to have 13 names and one of them's going to have 14. But Matthew says they both got 14. How did he get that? He counted one name twice, which is not fair to do if you're telling us 14, 14, and 14, unless you're giving it to us in an artificial manner for the purpose of memorization. So you count the names up between verse 12 down through verse 16, you'll find only 13 names, if you leave out Jeconias' name. And it would only be fair for counting father, son, all the way down the line to leave him out, since he's already been mentioned back in verse 11. Now that is very enlightening. Just right here in the first chapter of the New Testament, you learn a whole lot of things you didn't even know was there. And that's just in the first chapter of the New Testament. I wonder what else is in the New that you don't know. But this helps shed light back on 5 and 11 of Genesis, and the Old Testament helps shed light on what we're looking at, Matthew 1. Because we would know all those things, except the last thing that I just mentioned, without the Old Testament. The Old Testament gives us the names of those kings that are missing. So it's very interesting that you've got a chapter here that is purposely, artificially set up. And it's not something that Matthew's trying to hide. He knows that the people to whom he's writing, who are Jews, those were the recipients of Matthew's gospel, as opposed to, say, Mark's or Luke's, that they had their Old Testament. And most of them had all these things memorized anyway. So they would know, well, there are a couple of names mentioned here. Even someone who's not a Jew, if you're very familiar with the period of the kings, you'd recognize that some names are missing there. Now, if you're not, obviously you wouldn't recognize. But when you come down to Joram and you skip all the way down to Uzziah, if you knew anything about the kings, you'd know one or more, and we found out 3 names are missing there. If it's true here, and if it's done here, and if it's employed here for a purpose like that, then probably it is in a lot of other genealogies in the Bible. Which ones, we don't know. But probably in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, they were employed, just like it is here in Matthew 1. Then a second important passage we're not going to look at because it's so many names, and it is Ezra's genealogy. So I'll give you the passage you can compare at home. We trust all of you do these things we ask you to at home. It's for your own benefit. Doesn't help me if you compare them, but it'll help you. So you can consider it as homework, comparing Ezra 7, 1 to 5 with 1 Chronicles 6, 3 through 14. Now just look right away at the number of verses allotted to both passages. Which one do you think is going to be missing some names? Ezra. Ezra has left out 6 names, 6 generations. But yet between those 6 he left out, on the beginning of the absence of those names, he mentions someone. The end, he mentions someone, and he says this was the father of such and such. And he left out 6 generations. But more interesting than all of these is Moses' genealogy. And this is the third and final one we want to look at. We'll begin with some preliminary passages. 1 Chronicles 26:24, and then look at some ones that are more important. 1 Chronicles 26:24, the genealogy of Moses. But it does pay to know some of these things. Now, verse 24. You ought to know enough about the Old Testament to know two of these names. You probably won't know the third one, or the way it's listed here, the first one, but you should know two of these names. People from Sunday school know one of them, that being Moses. And Shebuel, the son of Gershom, the son of Moses. Now, do you remember whenever Moses took Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, priest of Midian, in Exodus chapter 2, then she bare a son unto him whose name was Gershom. And it says that very plainly there. So Gershom was the son of Moses. Then according to this passage, Shebuel is the son of Gershom. Totally impossible. Why? We're living right now, verse 24, during the time of David. That means from Moses to the time of David, 400 years were spanned by only 3 generations. Moses, and we know Moses was already up in his years before he had Gershom. And then Gershom, and then the third name, Shebuel. Now, 3 generations spanning 400 years, that might be possible back in Genesis 5. But that's not possible during 1400 to 1000 BC, which is the period that we're talking about. From the time of Moses, around 1400, to the time of David, around 1000 BC. 400 years, but we've only got 3 generations. It's impossible. Moses had Gershom. Gershom had a son. That son had a son. That son had a son. That son had a son. Until we finally get to this name here, Shebuel, who's living during the time of King David. And the same thing is said over in chapter 23. We won't look at the passage. Verses 15 and 16. Very same thing said, that Shebuel was the son of Gershom, who was the son of Moses, which simply is not true. But more interesting than all of those is over in Exodus chapter 6 and verse 20, where we get not to just a genealogy that relates to Moses, but one that specifically deals with him and the ancestors that come not after him, but before him. Exodus 6 and verse 20. Now, I want you to all see this, because most people in Sunday school have wrong ideas about what we're going to be looking at here. Amram took him Jochebed, his father's sister, to wife, and she bare him Aaron and Moses. And the years of the life of Amram were 137 years. Then, Numbers 26:59. The name of Amram's wife was Jochebed, the daughter of Levi, whom her mother bare to Levi in Egypt, and she bare unto Amram Aaron and Moses and Miriam, their sister. And the same thing is said over in 1 Chronicles 6 and verse 3. Was Amram Moses' father? Both of these passages say it so clearly, more clearly than just the begats and the begats, by saying this man took a wife, and this wife bare to him these 3 children, Aaron, Miriam, and Moses. Was Amram Moses and Aaron's and Miriam's father, and was Jochebed their mother? No. But just from that condensed form of the genealogy, it would appear that obviously Amram would be the father of Moses, and Jochebed would be his mother. And people who are good in denominational churches on Bible quizzes, they know that. You know, you ask them who, you might not have known that, but people that are good on Bible quizzes, you ask them who's Moses' father and mother, Amram and Jochebed. How can you forget names like that? Amram and Jochebed. They weren't the parents of Moses, though. How can we prove that? Numbers chapter 3. verses 17 and 19, verses 27 and 28. Numbers 3, 17, 19, and 27 and 28. Now you'll have to look at this to see what we're saying. We're talking in the priestly line of Levi now. Levi had 3 sons. You probably remember them, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. That's in verse 17, I believe. Numbers 3:17. Levi had 3 sons, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. Then verse 19, and Kohath had some sons. One of these was Amram. So that would make Amram, the son of Kohath, the grandson of Levi. The sons of Kohath, by their families, Amram, Izihar, Hebron, and Uzziel. All right, with that in mind, down to verse 27. Again, we're going to get a contradiction right here in the same chapter. And of Kohath was the family of the Amramites, and the family of the Izharites, and the family of the Hebronites, and the family of the Uzzielites. These are the families of the Kohathites. In the number of all the males from a month old and upward were 8,600 keeping the charge of the sanctuary. Now here we are, Numbers 3, 17 to 19, Numbers 3, verses 27 and 28. And what this would mean, that Moses' grandfather, who only lived, according to Exodus 6, to be 133 years of age, before he died, would have had these 4 sons that are mentioned back up in the verses we read, verses 17 to 19, and then in Moses' day, he's going to have, verse 28, 8,600 living descendants. Now that's just from Moses' grandfather, Kohath. Then Kohath has Amram. Remember that Amram has Moses. Now Kohath has 3 other sons. One of them is Amram. He has 3 other. And it mentions the names there in verse 27. Kohath, then Amram, and Amram's 3 brothers. But you take those 4 brothers together, and you'd say, well, Moses is the son of Amram, and Moses is living now. And you count verse 28, the number of all the males from a month old and upward, you've got 8,600 of them living at the same time. Now, where do you know anywhere that that's possible, that a grandfather can have 8,600 living descendants? I mean, I counted them up myself. My grandparents, and yours may have more, may have less, have nine living descendants. You know, a son or a daughter and their children and their children. I mean, pretty soon the grandparent's going to be dead. And he died at 133. But he's got 8,600 living descendants. It only took 2 generations to do that, and all of them are alive at the same time. Obviously, that's impossible. Kohath had someone, and someone had someone else, and sooner or later Amram came along, and then Amram had so-and-so, and it was a number of generations before finally we get to Moses. So at this time, Kohath can have 8,600 living descendants. But he can't have 8,600 living descendants just 2 generations removed from him, to his son, to his grandson. Totally impossible. But if there are omissions here, and Kohath really lived 3 centuries ago, or 2 centuries ago, well, maybe you can have 8,600 living descendants, all of them male. That doesn't count females. And we're told over in chapter 4 that there were 2,750 of them between the ages of 30 and 50. 2,750 between the ages 30 and 50. You've got a whole multitude of descendants, and they couldn't be living. So what we're saying is that obviously Amram was not the father of Moses. And what really makes that conclusive is the account. Remember the account of Moses' birth over in Exodus chapter 2 and verse 1. You know, it's interesting when we're given the full account of Moses' birth that the name of a mother and a father are noticeably absent. This would be the place to put the name of the mother and the father if those were really the literal mother and father. Look in Exodus 2 and verse 1. There went a man out of the house of Levi, and took to wife a daughter of Levi. The woman conceived and bare a son, and his name ended up, verse 10, being Moses. Very noticeably, the names aren't mentioned here because now we're given a full account. When you're given a full account of the birth story, obviously you can't use Amram and Jochebed because they're not the parents of Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. So, since we don't know who they were, all it says here is there was a man of the house of Levi, there was a wife of the daughter of Levi. And of course, remember who's writing all this, Moses. So he ought to know what he's talking about. But he doesn't give us his mother and father's name here. But it wasn't Amram and Jochebed. Although he says that, and it appears like that's what he means by that, in 6:20, and over there in Numbers 26, the 2 passages that we gave, and over in 1 Chronicles, the 3 passages that we gave, obviously that's not what he means. He expects us to do our studies and find out right there in Numbers 3, which he also wrote. Proves that a grandfather, just 2 generations removed from him, couldn't have 8,600 living descendants who are all males and maybe 8,600 female descendants who are all living. 20,000 descendants and you only took 2 generations. It's impossible. So, the conclusion is, from all of this, obviously we've got gaps somewhere in the genealogies of Genesis 5 and of Genesis 11. So what about the age of man, the age of the earth? Well, just because there are gaps, as we have already proven, doesn't mean you can stretch the time out into thousands of years. It's still probably only a short period of time, and it's only and strictly a guess, but probably the earth on the age of 10,000 years, on the average of 10,000 years of age.